Hi, I'm Bryan Tillis on behalf of US Chess, and in this series, I want to highlight the endgame technique of our best players. And also, the fantastic result that they had. Our women's team had the first medal in 16 years, thanks in large part to Carissa Yip, 10 and 11 on board 2 with an individual gold, and Alice Lee, who scored 8 out of 10 on board 4 for an individual silver. And though the men came in seeded number 1, I don't think we can be too disappointed with a silver medal. A fantastic result for both teams. And I believe in the history of US Chess, this is the highest our team has done for combined points. So let's get to these end games. So we're going to start off in this position where Alice Lee is in round 11 playing against Nurman, who's Kazakhstan. And when I look at endgames like this, I first have to ask the question, what are our goals and what are we trying to reach? So black being a pawn up, if you want to trade pawns, what's the best defensive structure? Where's our point B? Where's our lighthouse in the distance when playing this type of endgame with white? So if you pick up a book like Silman's Complete Endgame Course from Beginner to Master, he will highlight endgames, king and rook versus king and rook with an extra pawn, and all 3 of the pawns individually are covered. And we'll see in this video how the rook pawns and the knight pawns are very, very easy draws with passive defense. But if it is any other pawn, you'll need to know the Lucina and Philidor positions for good measure, which are covered in that aforementioned text. So in this case, if it is your move with white, what I'd like for you to do is pause the video and try to figure out what plan you would make here. All right, gave you an opportunity to pause. Let's find out what the player did in the game and then see her technique versus what Engine and the lowly NM would recommend. So in this case, Alice started with h3. And I want to note the placement of the rook on the 4th rank. Makes it very easy to push this pawn in the future. So technique-wise, won't matter too much for the overall optimal plan, as I would describe it. Because what is the worst pawn? It is the rook pawn. So typically, if we're going to trade, we want to start with this technique. So I like the idea of playing h4 immediately. And my machine friend gives this variation where eventually for black to make progress, they're going to need to move the g-pawn, and we get an ideal defensive structure. We will see later how this is relatively easy to hold once you have stopped the progress of the pawns. If in the initial position you said passive defense is the way to go, you could get into some trouble if black is able to move the entire phalanx and say get a pawn firmly secured on g3, which could create some back rank mating problems. That's one of the ways to potentially lose this game. So hopefully you were thinking, how can I trade pawns optimally and get a setup? So as we progress with the game, h3, rook c2, moving right along, and there's a bit of shuffling. And often people ask, well, why if black knows the technique that they need to be pushing pawns, why aren't they doing it immediately here? Could be a clock situation, could be just waiting to see what white will do, if white will try to force matters. So we're both kind of shuffling here a bit. And then finally, a move gets played. And what I want to note as well is if you lead with the h-pawn, This is going to be the easiest defensive setup. So h4, and then g3. Now, no matter how black tries to make progress here, we're going to be able to reach a relatively simple draw. So say, for instance, if black wants to keep the pawns together and plays f6, well, we can check and then bother the pawn. Rinse and repeat. And in the event of, say, rook a5, even if we're nice and allow black to trade this pawn, the reason we want the rook pawn extended is so that when we capture, we have separated the pawns, making them weaker, and this endgame will be relatively easy to hold. If the h pawn eventually gets traded for our g pawn, we need to know the Philidor draw, which we can get to from this position. And we will see shortly that if the f pawn is traded for the g pawn, if our king is touching the queening square when it's a rook pawn, our rook can just shuffle back and forth on the back rank, and we will be good to go. So coming back to the main game here after rook b4, check. Finally, some progress is made, and here we see Alice's plan. Makes little difference from mine, technique-wise. You're waiting for that moment to play h4. Whether you played it before or you're playing it now, there's really no way to avoid this pawn trade. Check, good technique. Trade, and now the optimal defensive setup. And we'll see the rest of this game if this pawn is ever traded. This is going to be a very straightforward draw. So rook c7. And we just want to keep our king close to the pawn so we can defend. If this rook came over, we could very easily defend laterally. Now, the only chance black has is to get the king to the ideal square and win the pawn. So as long as we prevent this, we're good to go in the position. Our king is currently setting a barrier here, so we just flick the king away. We need to make sure that we're not going to lose space. Cannot allow this king to get in. So what's a good move for our rook to prevent the black king from getting in? So when you ask the question that way, some may have thought rook a4. Our king is already doing the job, though. Rook a3. Now, flick the king away. You must worry about the weakness. With this king cut off, it's very, very hard for black to make any progress. We can just shuffle again. And shuffle, shuffle. And I'll show you if, say for instance, f5. All you need to do is get your king on the queening square and place the rook passively. Now just shuffle the rook back and forth. With both the knight pawn or the rook pawn, this passive defense works. Because at this point, black can't make progress. We just check the king away, win the pawn. And if we place the rook here first, and this happens, we're back to just shuffling again. Back and forth with the rook. The pawn is not going to queen. So having these lighthouse themes are very important when playing these types of endgames. I wanted to highlight that in the video. So rook b6. And then there was a transition where black goes, all right, white clearly understands the technique of how to draw. So I'm going to see if we can test the king and pawn endgame. Personally, I do not have this much faith in my king and pawn endgame. I would keep the rook on the board. If you're not sure, always keep that last piece. But Alice shows exactly how to handle this king and pawn endgame with the opposition concept. And here, first we get distant opposition. Again, step back. Opposition, opposition. That way we can get direct opposition. Make sure getting that, and here, still playing blocker. And it's a good example of using opposition. And they agreed to a draw after King D7 was played, or there was an error in recording with the DGT board. But say, for instance, if Black tried to make progress with F5, I've seen students in the past mess up this draw because they're thinking every move. You can really turn off thinking by having a rule. When the king is playing defense, if you need to step back, step straight back in front of the pawn. And any time the aggressor king, I should say, is trying to make progress, you step in front of the king with opposition. So in front of the pawn, straight back, get opposition. And no matter how they shuffle or try to trick you, you will easily make the draw there. And I would practice it with low time when practicing these types of endgames with a training partner or with an engine to make sure you got it, because nerves can run high in tournament games and you can drop that half point. So practice under a little bit of pressure and you'll find success. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe.